on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. If you want to join me. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountains, majesties above the fruited plains. America, God shed His grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Thank you.
And I want to thank Seth Abramovich for being here with me, and I want to thank you, the marvelous Jimmy Demers, for singing that song that all of us into our hearts. And I realize that tonight I'm speaking not only to those of you who are gathered here in Los Angeles, but I'm speaking to the country about as important a matter, not only as we will ever discuss in our lifetimes, but as important a matter and as important a juncture in our history as any generation has ever dealt with. The vast majority of people who are listening to me tonight, wherever you are, and that includes, of course, the people who are here, have listened, or just listened to at least part of the 3-hour DNC debate. And the people who were on that debate stage tonight are, in my experience, all of them are very, very lovely people. My critique of this system has really nothing to do with the critique of the individuals, but it does have to do with a critique of our conventional political establishment in the sense of how it's going about all this. When I listened tonight, I felt kind of like it was like eating leftovers. I felt it was not as exciting as we need to be. And of course, it's not, the candidates are not responsible for the questions that are being asked by the media, so it's not, it's an entire system, political media industrial complex, I call it. The problem we have is that we have to defeat Donald Trump and we have to change this country. And I do not believe that the conversation that we heard tonight, I won't say it won't defeat him because I don't even want to put those words in the air. I think it's going to have a very difficult time, however, defeating him, because that conversation does not get to the heart of the matter. And when you have something going on that's got a very dark heart, the only way that you can override that is with a very light-filled heart. And so I want to have a conversation with you. I feel like I have a message for the American people, and my message for the American people is I have some good news and I have some bad news. And I want to be really honest and really clear about what the good news is. But in order to get there, we have to be very honest and very clear about what the bad news is. And we have to start with that. You know, if you go to a doctor, and you want the doctor to heal you, of course, but the doctor will not be able to heal you if the doctor isn't also going to be honest with you. What if the test results didn't come back as you wished? What if the test results say it's cancer? You have to expect the doctor to tell you the truth, because if the doctor doesn't tell you the truth about what's wrong, then you're not going to get into a real answer about what the solution is. In our political system, I believe the same is true. Your politician should tell you the truth. The politician should tell you what's really going on. But we have a political system in which the politicians too often don't tell you about what's really going on. They have operatives telling you that would sound too negative, that would sound, that would depress people, so don't go there. And the problem with that is that it's turned us into children. It's infantilized the population. Politicians too often talk to us like we're in junior high school or something, like we can't take bad news. And that's a problem for many, many reasons. One of the issues that brings up for me is something that I've experienced working with people who have heard bad news for the entirety of my career, for 35 years. People don't usually come to me because things are going well. So when people come to me, they ask if we can have a counseling session. Usually it's not just to discuss all the great stuff happening in their lives. So I'm very used to up close and personal conversations with people who have just heard some very bad news. It might be that the test results came back and it was cancer. Might be that their child is addicted and it's heroin. Might be that their spouse has said, it's over, I'm gone, no more. It might be that their business is going bust, bankruptcy, everything's gone to hell in whatever form. But I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about what actually transforms a crisis into an opportunity. But I've also learned about human beings when human beings are faced with bad news. And what I've seen over and over and over again, and what has meant a lot to me in my own life, at times when I've heard bad news, is that all of a sudden, in the first 5 minutes, all the ultimately unimportant details that normally preoccupy our lives just fall away. All the things that we go around every day thinking about all the time, but that are so ultimately unimportant just fall away. And that happens, and who people really are comes to the fore. And so I've seen over and over and over again people confronted with the worst crisis that has ever occurred in their lives, finding for the first time in their lives how noble and how intelligent and how mature they can be. That, to me, is what we need in this country. We need a president. We need politicians. We need leaders who are going to be honest so that we can be noble, so that we can be intelligent. And if a politician or a president or a presidential candidate isn't getting real with you about what's really wrong, watch out, ladies and gentlemen, because that's the way to never get to what really can be right. And so first, I want to give you the context. We have some serious problems. And they're not just on the level of symptom. And they're not just things that are amenable to incremental change. Oh, a policy shift here, that'll change it, that'll fix it all. Policy shift there, that'll change it, that'll fix it all. Not necessarily. On one hand, it's true that we got to where we are because of bad policy, and we will change where we are because of good policy. That part is true. But we got to where we are not just because of bad policy. We got to where we are because people were checked out enough that we acquiesced to bad policy. We got to where we are because bad policy had an easy time coming about. We took our eyes off the ball. We forgot that democracy is supposed to be power in the hands of the people. But power is not in your hands if it's not in your heart. It's not in your hands if it's not in your mind. If the principles of our democracy are merely written on marble walls somewhere, or they're written on parchment and they're behind glass somewhere in Washington or elsewhere, and we can pride ourselves, because when my child was in the 8th grade, I sent her or him to Washington. They've seen the Declaration of Independence. If that's as far as it goes, but those principles are no longer alive in us, then I'll tell you what happens. We become a generation that's easy to play, and that's exactly what has happened. John Adams said that he hoped, our second president, John Adams, said that he hoped that on July 4th of every year, we would revisit first principles. That's a startlingly modern idea. What it really means is take a look at your mission statement, because that's what the Declaration of Independence is. It is our mission statement. So I want to go over with you tonight. You know, in the Jewish religion, it says that every generation has to rediscover God for itself. Every generation of Americans has to rediscover those principles for ourselves. So let's take them in. Let's not just know them. If we just know them, but we didn't take them in for ourselves, and too many generations go along like that, then you're in trouble, and we're in trouble now. Number one, all men are created equal. Number two, God gave all men inalienable rights of life and of liberty and of the pursuit of happiness. And number three, boy, this is where it gets good. Governments are instituted to secure those rights. And number four, if the government's not doing its job, it's the right of the people to alter it or abolish it. Now, when you take that in, you see a lot of things going on in this country, and you go, what the hell is happening here? You know, when we were kids and we used to say the Pledge of Allegiance, and we do as adults, of course. But I remember saying to a friend of mine several years ago, I see all these classrooms, I don't see these kids saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Why aren't they saying the Pledge of Allegiance? And I remember my friend erupted, you know, because there is no liberty and justice for all in America, man. And I thought to myself, well, it's true. There's not right now liberty and justice for all. But the fact that when I was a little girl, I put my hand in front of my heart and I swore allegiance to the idea that there would be is what turned me into a woman who gets really pissed off when I see it not happening. So you have to remember what you're supposed to be going for, so that when we see things happening that are so divergent from what we've all been told is supposed to happen in America. No, this is not a reason for cynicism. Cynicism is just an excuse for not helping. This is not a reason for whining, and it is not a reason for despair. It is a reason, however, for nonviolent political revolution. Elect me president, and that is what we're going to have in this country. The system is more corrupt. The system is more corrupt even than we knew. Or I would say it's just about as corrupt as we all suspect. We do suspect it, and I think that that's what happened in the last presidential election. There was a tremendous cry of rage, a tremendous cry of despair. And I thought during that election campaign season, that's why I thought that it was going to be either Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump who was probably going to be the channel for all that rage and that despair. Because both of them were naming the pain. They were naming the rage, and the point is that the rage was and is valid. It was and is valid because what people felt was that the system was rigged. Ladies and gentlemen, it was rigged, and it still is rigged. And it will not be unrigged just because we go back to a better form of system rigged. What we need to do is unrig the system. We have to know that this has been going on for 40, 50, 60 years. We need to see what the rigging is, and we have to be willing to unrig it. Starting 40 years, this whole canard about trickle-down economics began. This whole idea that the only responsibility of the American corporation really was fiduciary responsibility to its own stockholders. Now, once you did that, and that was different than what happened before. You know, I'm old enough that I have come to that age in life where I feel we're supposed to be keepers of the story. And I always want to say to young people, it wasn't always like this. I'm not being romantic about American history before this period, but there was a time, you've got to hear me, there was a time when even though America got it wrong a lot, there was still a general consensus that we were supposed to try to get it right. We were at least supposed to be trying to live democratic values. We were supposed to be trying to live moral leadership around the world. We were supposed to be trying to embody and to actualize the principles of liberty and justice for all. Now, it's like we're not even pretending. And that is very, very, very dangerous. Before this trickle-down economics theory took hold of our society the way it did, corrupting our government, and so corrupting our entire moral value system. Before that, the American corporation, can you imagine this, was expected to care. If somebody had worked for a corporation for decades, the corporation was expected to care whether or not that person then had a dignified retirement. But once trickle-down economics took hold, and it was backed by so much money, and they got a president, and they had foundations. It all just became such a huge thing. The idea was that if all that the corporation had to do was care about the bottom line for its stockholders, then that meant that concern was even at the expense of the workers, and even at the expense of the environment, and even if it was at the expense of the community. From there, ladies and gentlemen, we've been going downhill ever since. Because within 10 to 20 years after that, money exploded as such an unwieldy, dominant influence on our political system that it wasn't just corporations that were acting that way. The U.S. government was acting as a handmaiden to those corporations. So what happened then was that the U.S. government did more and still does more to advocate for short-term profits for huge corporate conglomerates than it does to advocate for the well-being, the safety, the health of we, the people of the United States, of our children, of all the people of the world, and of the planet on which we live. Ladies and gentlemen, the people must step in now. people wanted a change, and of course the worst kind of change is what they got, because they did not get someone who doesn't come from that system. They got someone who comes from the economic elite side of that system. But just saying that we will replace that by the same system, but just the political side of it, is not the answer. Ladies and gentlemen, slavery was not abolished because the United States government woke up one day and said, let's abolish slavery. No, that's not what happened. The abolitionist movement emerged from the people. The people woke up, the people stepped up, and the people stepped in. And the same was true of the women's suffragette movement. The US government did not wake up one day and say, oh, let's give women the right to vote. No, that's not what happened. The women's suffragette movement, meaning the people woke up, the people stepped up, and the people stepped in. And I'll also tell you that the US government didn't wake up one day and say, let us desegregate the South and end institutionalized white supremacy in the American South. That is not what happened. With Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, the people woke up, the people stepped up, and the people stepped in. And yet today, we're being asked to believe that the same political status quo that drove us into this ditch, that those are the only people qualified to lead us out of this ditch. Let me tell you something, I'm not surprised they worked so hard to keep me off of that debate stage. And I'll tell you something else. When people say that I, up on that debate stage, was out of my depth, ladies and gentlemen, there is no depth there. Nice people, but we, the people, are the power in this country. You know, political parties were not even mentioned in the US Constitution, and George Washington warned us against them. I am a proud Democrat, but I'll tell you something, I don't care what political party it is. Its job is to facilitate democracy, not to dictate democracy. Yes! We have been trained into a kind of powerlessness. We are being treated by a conventional political establishment like poker chips. How many do you have? How many do you have? And that leads people into telling you what they think you want to hear. Yes. It's just a game of people pleasing. I'll say this to you and maybe your group would like that and you'll vote for me. I'll say this to you and maybe your group would like that and you'll vote for me. I'll say this to your group, you'll like that and you'll vote for me. I'm not doing any of that. I'm not talking to you any differently if you're rich or poor or black or white or Christian or Muslim or Jewish or gay or straight. I'm talking to you as Americans. And I'm not talking to you thinking you're going to like everything I say. That's not what the doctor is there for. That's not what the healer is there for, and that is not what they're there for. Your president should tell you what the president believes you really need to hear, and that is what I'm doing as a candidate for the presidency of the United States. It's not that I'm against capitalism, I'm not actually, but there is a virulent strain of capitalism that has taken hold of this country for the last 40 years. It is a capitalism that has gone completely off the rails into a place of complete amorality. And when you have an amoral economic system, it will always lead to immoral consequences. And so what we have is a situation now, as we know, where because of all this, the wealth inequality is greater than it's been in almost 100 years. 1% of Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90%. Our middle class has been decimated. So let me tell you what we need to do. We need to repeal the 2017 $2 trillion tax cut that gave 83 cents of every dollar to the very richest people among us. We need to stop those corporate subsidies where, for instance, last year $26 billion went to the oil and gas companies alone. Look at the way the US government so completely betrayed its own people by agreeing to big pharmaceutical companies, oh, we won't be able. We give away the right to negotiate for lower drug prices. None of that surprising. Last year alone, Big Pharma lobbied US Congress for $284 million. That's almost twice as much as oil and gas, which only lobbied Congress to $125 million. And let's not kid ourselves. When those huge multinational corporate entities lobby Congress people for hundreds of millions of dollars, they want something in return. And boy, they got it and they get it. They won't anymore, however, when I am president of the United States. In addition to that, our military budget is now $750 billion. I think we'd all agree that the U.S. military should get every dollar that it needs for legitimate security purposes. My father fought in World War II. I think we all have a genuine and meaningful respect for the U.S. military. My critique is not of the military. It's of the political decisions that have less to do with our legitimate security needs and more to do with short-term profit maximization for defense contractors. And there are those who say that there are up to hundreds of billions, possibly even $300 billion of dollars over and above what the military says that they need that is involved in that $750 billion military budget. All of that gives you an idea, ladies and gentlemen, of where I think money would come from. You do the things that I just said, plus I agree with Senator Warren about the 2% tax on assets of billionaires, 3% on those who have 50 million and more. And guess what's going to happen after we do all the things that I just said? We're going to have some cash on hand. And let me tell you what we're going to do once we have that cash on hand. We are going to realize all the ways in which we have betrayed our principles, and we're going to fix it. We're going to realize all the ways in which we've betrayed our people, and we are going to fix it. We are going to realize all the ways in which we have betrayed the world with U.S. policies, and we're going to fix that. And we're going to realize all those ways that we have betrayed the earth on which we stand, and we are going to fix it. Now, when you have an economic system that is so intent on just serving its own bottom line, and let's be very clear here, this is a very pregnant moment because there are some very powerful capitalist corporate leaders right now who think in many ways similar to the things I'm articulating tonight. So it's not like these people are stupid. We now have people who represent great corporate power who are saying that this needs to change. These people are not dumb. They know that American capitalism has so gone off the rails, that so needs to reclaim an ethical center, that at this point, if they don't get their stuff together, it won't be Bernie or Elizabeth or Marianne calling them to an account. What will happen if they don't course correct is that an entire younger generation of Americans will ultimately begin to storm the Bastilles. An entire generation of Americans will be saying, what is it about socialism I'm supposed to be so scared of? The free health care or the free college? Millions of Americans will be young Americans will be coming up saying, what is it I'm supposed to be so impressed by, and what has global capitalism ever done for me? If I'm president of the United States, I would be much like Franklin Roosevelt when he said, I'm not destroying capitalism, I'm saving capitalism. Because the virulent form of capitalism, virulent strain of capitalism that now has us by the throat is one which is heartless. And nothing that is heartless leads to anything but chaos. Nothing that is heartless leads to anything but destruction. Nothing that is heartless leads to anything but defeat Donald Trump in 2020. When you have an economic system that is so based on increasing shareholder bottom line, the shareholders are only considered and not the other stakeholders, then you have two populations that are hurt first. And those are the two sections of the population, two portions of the population which simply are not of service to that system. One, because it's not old enough, and number two, because it is considered no longer useful, and that is America's children and America's elderly. Now remember, ladies and gentlemen, all people are created equal, and God gave all people inalienable rights of life and of liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Millions of American children in this country are traumatized. This goes so much deeper than the conversation about education or even about trauma that they were having at the debate, the DNC debate tonight. We have millions of American children who are traumatized before preschool. We have millions of American children who go to school every day in classrooms where they do not even have adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. We have children who are hungry. 13 million children are hungry in America. Why weren't we talking about poverty? Why aren't we talking about children who are hungry? Why aren't we talking about hungry Americans? No, we're not, because we're only talking about the conversation that serves the system as it is. It will only talk about questions that it is convenient trying to fix. And so we need to talk about the fact that 13 million children are traumatized in the United States. We need to talk about the fact that there are millions of children who live in what are called America's domestic war zones. where psychologists tell us that the PTSD is so great, it's no less severe than that of a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq. I read an article in the Chicago paper recently that it's estimated that 40% of the girls who go to public schools in Chicago have severe PTSD. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a humanitarian emergency, and it should be considered a humanitarian. These children who are full-on American citizens, by the way, full-on American citizens, and even those who aren't. We should be rescuing these children no differently than if they were the victims of a natural disaster. But we have to go further, and we have to be smart, and we have to ask ourselves why they're not. Why are they basically invisible to the conventional political system? Why is it that their despair, that the answer of the conventional political system to the despair of these children is to simply normalize it? Gee, why is that? Let's talk about why it is. Because it's just a power game. It's just a money game, see? These children aren't old enough to vote, and so they're not a constituency. You know, they're not one of the poker chips. And they're not old enough to work. So what possible clout could they exercise to compete with the huge multinational corporate forces whose money flood Washington every day? What can a child in a poor neighborhood in the United States do to compete with the power of health insurance companies, big pharmaceutical companies, gun manufacturers, chemical companies, food companies, oil and gas companies, and defense contractors? Ladies and gentlemen, the conventional political system is not coming to the aid of these children. It's time for you and me. We need to step in. And that is why I want a United States Department of Children and Youth. Right now we have an education department, and we have family and children services as part of Health and Human Services. But ladies and gentlemen, the system goes so much deeper than that. And where do you think these children are going to be in 20 years? We need trauma-informed education. We need community wraparound services. We need health and nutrition for children. We need to deal with the fact that we have a relatively high maternal mortality rate, and much worse among people of women of color. We need to deal with a high infant mortality rate. We need to deal with the fact that babies, even when they're born, do not necessarily have the food that they need in this country. We need training for families. We need health. We need emotional and psychological learning techniques in school. We need restorative justice. We need conflict resolution. We need mindfulness in the schools. Now, what would all of that take? Let's talk about what it would take. What it would take is the expertise, and this is what I see all over this country. I see it in the area of children. I see it in the area of the environment. I see it in the area of peace building. I see it in every possible area that needs repair. We have the people. We have them here in Los Angeles, people who do incredible work with children, social workers, educators, early childhood experts, incredible work that's done here in Los Angeles, like in every area of the United States, with the formerly incarcerated, with battered women. We have the people who know what to do, but we have people who really know how to repair this country, who are doing everything that they can to have a fundraiser where maybe they'll raise $50,000, maybe they'll raise $100,000, and we have a government that is then giving hundreds of millions of dollars to the very corporate and other moneyed forces whose overreach then has to be dealt with and pushed back by these people who are trying to help people. This is how rotten it is. And when you have politicians that come and say, oh, I'm going to increase the spending. You know, what are they talking about? They're going to increase the spending. They're going to increase the spending by maybe 10 million here, 20 million there, maybe 50 million over here. You see, ladies and gentlemen, what the conventional political system, even the conventional democratic political system does right now. You have a Republican establishment that just looks at all this, and basically they're not even pretending. Too many of them just say, what of it? And then you have a Democratic establishment that definitely cares about the pain and definitely passes bills to the best of their ability to ameliorate the pain. I'm telling you, in the United States today, we need a massive awakening, a season of repair. You know, some presidents initiate periods of change. Some presidents consolidate change. A president such as myself would be one of those presidents who presides over a season of repair. And a season of repair is one in which we don't just ameliorate the suffering of so many people who are living at the effect of this huge corruption and injustice. We need to challenge the underlying forces that make all that suffering inevitable. And that's what we need to do with the children. The second issue that we have to talk about in a way that is real and is deep is race in America. I appreciate that Beto O'Rourke tonight was talking about how he supports Sheila Jackson Lee's bill on reparations. If I hear one more conversation about how we're going to study it, okay? How much more evidence do you need, guys? How much more evidence do you need? And let me tell you something. I want to explain, you probably all know that I don't have a plan for a study. I have a plan. I have a plan. Oh, I have lots of plans, by the way, in case anybody tells you I don't have plans. Go to Marianne 2020, which you're already at. I just told you about my plan for Department of Children and Youth. I've told you about my economic plans. I want to tell you about my plan for reparations. And I want to tell you about why I believe that we need reparations as opposed to race-based policies. Most people, when they talk about reparations, are actually talking about race-based policies. They're talking about giving money to historical black colleges. They're talking about anti-discrimination in housing and employment, economics, all of which is very true, all of which needs to be done. But for me, first of all, if I owe you money, I don't get to tell you how to spend it. And if I owe you money, I'm not going to tell you, I owe you money, but instead of giving you the money, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. That is an extension of the same paternalism that was the problem. So the thing about reparations have moral value. Reparations have a moral and a spiritual value that go beyond race-based policies because they involve more than economic restitution. They carry the moral authority of a statement of a wrong that has been done, a debt that is owed, and the willingness on the part of a people to pay it. So let's talk about very quickly what this is about. The first enslaved persons were brought to the United States in 1619. Slavery was not abolished in the United States until the end of the Civil War, obviously 1865. That's coming up on 250 years. After that, the United States embarked on a period of institutionalized violence against blacks that was for another 100 years in the form of segregation, in the form of, for instance, what is lynchings if not domestic terror? What is Ku Klux Klan if not domestic terror? So what happened was you had 250 years of slavery. At the end of that, General Tecumseh Sherman promised to all former slave families of 4, 40 acres and a mule. Even in the cases where that was given, which were not many, that was taken back when the federal troops left, and the Southern legislatures passed what were called Black Code laws. And Black Code laws were to ensure subpar economic and political and social opportunities for black people. Now, 100 years after the end of the Civil War, in 1964, the U.S. Congress passed and Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act dismantled segregation. The next year, they passed the Voting Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act ensured to black people equal opportunities at the polls. It's worth noting that in 2013, the John Roberts-led Supreme Court began chipping away at the Voting Rights Act, which is why we have this spate of voter suppression efforts throughout the country today. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, some things good have happened. Certainly it's good that we ended slavery, obviously. It's very good that we ended segregation, obviously. But among other things, I think we'd all agree that if you've been kicking somebody to the ground, and I think we'd all agree that 350 years of institutionalized violence against black people is certainly kicking them to the ground. I think we'd all agree that you have a moral responsibility to do more than to stop kicking. You have a moral responsibility to say, here, let me help you get back up. Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations since the end of World War II. That doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen, but it's gone far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. Also in 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act, whereby we gave to all the Japanese internment camps during World War II between $20 and $22,000. I say that to just point out that by the middle of the 20th century, the idea of one people that had wronged another people paying economic restitution was not considered a fringe or an unusual idea, and it should not be considered so by us. If you were to look at 40 acres and a mule given to every slave family of 4, given that there were 4 to 5 million slaves at the end, enslaved people at the end of Civil War, we would be talking, of course, about trillions of dollars today. I don't believe that that's politically feasible, but I'll tell you what I do believe is politically feasible, and that is what I have submitted as my plan of reparations between $200 and $500 billion that would be dispersed over a period of 20 years. What I propose is a reparations council made up of somewhere around 50, perhaps a few more, perhaps a few less, people who themselves are descendants of American slaves, come from a cross-section of American culture, academia, and political leadership. And the stipulation on the part of the U.S. government would be that this money is to be used for purposes of economic and educational renewal. Then how the money is dispersed, whether it has to do with venture capital for black businesses, whether it has to do with historical black colleges or whatever. To be honest, ladies and gentlemen, this would not be a decision being made by white America.
Wow.
That's the point. Now, notice what I'm saying here. I'm talking in everything when I say we need a season of repair. Everything that I'm talking about might sound like, whoa, that's a lot. That's exactly it, ladies and gentlemen. We have in our society today a systems breakdown. A systems breakdown, the kind of transformation that you and I need to have happen, will not happen just because of a policy shift here and a policy shift there. We need an entire awakening of consciousness among the American people, that we see that this season of repair is not something where you will simply elect people and they will change some policies. This is something that must involve each and every one of us. I'm not asking you to send me to Washington to fight for you. I don't want to. I don't want to go to Washington and fight for you, but I do want to go to Washington and co-create with you. Because what we need to do in Washington, is what you need to do in Los Angeles and Sacramento. What I want to do in Washington is what we need to do in every city in the United States and every capital of every state. We need an awakening. What happened here was we naively thought we could take our eye off the ball and not begin to lose our democracy. Silly us. If you don't take care of your body, how surprised you can be if, like, hello, you got sick. If you don't take care of your marriage, how surprised can you be if, hello, they're gone. If you don't take care of your business, how surprised can you be if, hello, I don't have any business left. We didn't really take care of our democracy. And now, at this very, very late hour, where we are far too close to the cliff, there's a mass awakening of people who know we're in trouble here. But ladies and gentlemen, we need to do more than just not go over the cliff. We need to get out of the vicinity of the cliff entirely. And that is why it is ridiculous to think that those who drove us into this cliff are the only people qualified to lead us out of the vicinity. Now, one of the areas, although Seth, I don't know, maybe I should be leaving this there. I was going to talk about the environment now. Maybe I should be leaving this to you to ask me these questions. Should I just go through these 3 other pillars and then bring you up here?
Go for it.
Okay, so I've already talked to you about 2. We've talked about we need to create a moral economy. Number 2, we need to take care of America's children, which is this huge sea of unnecessary human suffering. And number 3, we need to talk about race, but we have to have a real conversation about race. Enough with the talking ad nauseum, ad nauseum. Don't you want to actually do something? This is the thing, ladies and gentlemen. We are hardwired for greatness. Why? Because we're Americans. See, this is the thing. Americans are like a big, big airplane. You put an airplane in the sky and it's like, whoa. But if it's just kind of on the runway, it's this huge, clunky piece of metal. It's kind of like kind of like a sports car. If you just have a great sports car driving around a residential neighborhood, you wouldn't really know how great it was. But you put it on a highway and it's like, whoa, look at that thing. We are hardwired for great things. Americans are not so weary because we're doing too much. We're actually tired and weary because we're not doing enough really great things. We're hardwired for that. That's in the DNA of Americans. And that's why this massive mobilization that I'm talking to you about, this is not only what is necessary, but in a way this massive mobilization is what we all yearn for. All of us have deep in our hearts the thought, I could have sworn I was born for something important. Wow. You were, so let's do something important. And the next area where we have to do something really important, because those economic changes are important, the issue of our children is important, the issue of race is important, the next two are really important. First, our environmental crisis. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a bigger crisis on our hands than just a climate crisis. Our entire ecosystem is imploding. It's not just the weather. It's the water, it's the food, it's the air, it's the soil. You know there are contaminants in the drinking water of the United States that's so great that our EPA only regulates about 70 chemicals, but we have 125,000 chemicals that are actually in use in commerce. We have situations that are so great that here we are talking about how we're going to provide health care, but as you've probably heard me say before, the issue is not just that we need to figure out how we're going to pay for health care. What we need to be thinking about is, how come we're all so sick all the time? That's the real question. The question is not just how to pay for health care. The issue is for us to ask ourselves, why do we have so much more chronic illness than they do in other countries? And if we're going to look at that, we have to ask ourselves also about our food policies, also about our chemical policies, also about our water. On one hand, you could say this president, which he has gutted the Clean Water Act, gutted the Clean Air Act, rolled back the Obama-era rules against selling pesticides that we absolutely know harm a child's brain. But a lot of this was going on even before Trump. For instance, these contaminants and the fact that the EPA was not regulating them. And one of the reasons the EPA doesn't regulate them is not just because of Democrats or Republicans, but because the Office of Budget and Management is making these decisions where we spend our money. And one of the reasons that they don't have the EPA regulate more is because the U.S. government is one of the main polluters when you look at things like NASA and you look at things like the Department of Defense. This whole thing goes so deep. Among other things, ladies and gentlemen, some of the worst contaminants in our water, some of the worst poisons and toxins come from our hospitals, come from our hospices, which should have filters. Remediation and filters outside them, just like any polluting factory would have. These are the kinds of things that we do not pay for. Why? Well, when you're giving a $2 trillion tax cut to the very richest individuals, where you've got the 83 cents of every dollar are going to the richest people, we've had such a massive transfer of wealth into the hands of a very few people. And what has happened is what is happening. We should, of course, put back in those middle-class tax cuts. But until we realize the massive mobilization that is necessary here, it is bigger even than just the climate crisis as we know it. Of course, we need to join the Paris Peace Accords again, but that's almost like kindergarten at this point. We need to reverse climate change, not only with carbon sequestration, not only with reforestation, not only with the development of clean energy and clean, sustainable energy that will enable us to have different forms of transportation. Not only do we need to deal with these animal factory farmings and these CAFOs where there's so much nitrous oxide and so much methane, even if you did everything else, climate change would still be the terrible crisis that it is if we did not deal with the animal factory farming. Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, this kind of mobilization, in order for us to deal with the fact, what is happening to our planet is much like what would happen is your pancreas is sick, and your lungs are sick, and your heart is sick, and your abdomen is sick. This is an implosion that we are facing here. It is not just hurricanes, it is not just sea level, it is not just floods. It is something where we do not even know what the consequences will be if, in fact, all the systems reach a high level of stress and of challenge at the same time. The American people need to wake up. And we need to now know that all of us are ready. We're not leaving it to this government. We have become mentally trained to think they're going to do it. We all need to be involved in this, and we need to see the mobilization for the protection and the repair of our ecosystem as important, as significant, and as massive a mobilization as was World War II.
And do we need a Green New Deal? Oh, you betcha we need a Green New Deal. But we need a Green New Century. We need a Green New Century. So all of the plans that have to do with decarbonization, the end to the carbonized era, all the issues of whether it's 2040 or 2045 or 2050 is less significant than the realization that we are not willing to acquiesce any longer to politicians who say, well, we want to do all this, but of course we have to make oil and gas happy, but of course we have to make the chemical companies happy. Oh, we want to do all this, but we want to make them happy. No, we don't have to make anybody happy. That's not what this is about. This is about saving our planet. This is about saving our country. This is about saving our democracy. Yes. And I'll tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, there's one last pillar to a moral politics. And nothing less than this vision, by the way, I don't believe will be exciting enough to the American people to defeat Donald Trump. Well, I don't want to say that because I don't want to put it in the air. We are going to defeat Donald Trump because whoever the nominee is, we are all going to be so involved in doing it. But I will tell you this, ladies and gentlemen, Donald Trump didn't win just because of the people who were so excited about Donald Trump. And Donald Trump will not win. If he were to win again, he would not win only because of the people who were so excited about Donald Trump. This is the issue, ladies and gentlemen. The people who really love Donald Trump will be voting for Donald Trump again in 2020. The people who really can't stand the agenda of the Trump administration will not be voting for Donald Trump. They will be voting for the Democrat. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not enough to guarantee a win for us. We have to get people excited to vote, people who didn't vote, or people who voted third party. We have to have an agenda that is so big and so exciting and so phenomenal and involves such energy and such motivation and such inspiration that it can take on Donald Trump any day. And that's not just prosecuting a case against Donald Trump, because I'll tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, there are a lot of people who voted for him who are very disturbed by this president. But if all we go on and on about is how bad Donald Trump is, who are you talking to when you talk like that? Because that's shaming people, and that's a form of emotional violence. So if I say to you and you voted for Donald Trump and you're already worried, but I start telling you how bad he is, that's not going to make you want to vote for me. So ladies and gentlemen, we don't need to tell the American people who Donald Trump is. We don't need to tell the American people what he does. They know. What we need to do is provide for the American people the good news on the other side of the bad news, the honesty about what's wrong, and the endless possibilities for making it right. The last one. Now, I've got one more area of... I've got one more area of bad news I have to tell you, and then we'll get to the good news, and then we'll bring Seth up here. We have to talk about war and peace. You know, we're brought up to think America's the good guy. And I'm not saying we were ever always the good guy, but there used to be a consensus that we were supposed to try to be the good guy. Do you even realize that right now, for the sake of a $350 billion arms sale, we are giving aerial support to the war that Saudi Arabia is prosecuting against Yemen? Wow. And tens of thousands of people have been starved, many of them children. Bernie Sanders was among those who led a bipartisan effort to get the president to stop this. The president vetoed the effort, and they didn't have enough votes to override his veto for $350 billion in arms sale. Now, our current Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was asked, how can the United States do this? You know, our grandparents would roll over in their graves. How can the United States take part in a genocidal war? And do you know what he said? He said, sometimes you have strategic partnerships with people who do not share your values. You know what, ladies and gentlemen? No, you don't. And no, you can't. All that means is that you have no values. You know, I met the Dalai Lama several years ago, and he told me that the people of the world no longer see the United States as a champion of democracy. What we do in our international policies are no different over the last few decades, no different in our international policies than in our domestic policies. Too often, American policy has more to do with advocacy for corporate interests, for American corporate interests, than it has to do with the people of the United States, the people of the world, or the planet on which we live. This will not stop through mere incremental change. It will stop when we, the people, understand what's happened here. You know, you can't just take medicine, can you? You also have to cultivate health. Sickness is the absence of health. Health isn't the absence of sickness. And the same with war and peace. War is the absence of peace. Peace is not the absence of war. We have to cultivate peace, just like we have to be prepared for war if war must come. Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense under George Bush, he said that we must wage peace. General Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense, left not too long ago, but when he was there, he said, if you don't fully fund the State Department, I will have to buy more ammunition. So what's happening here is that we have a $750 billion military budget, but we have a $40 billion budget at the State Department, and the State Department is diplomacy and development and mediation. Within that, $17 billion USAID, which is long-term development and humanitarian assistance, and then less than $1 billion goes to the peace builders. Peace builders, both domestically and internationally. Peace building takes as much expertise and sophistication as does war preparedness. And what is peace building around the world? The 4 factors which, when present, mean that there's a higher incidence of peace and statistically indicates a lower incidence of conflict are expanded economic opportunities for women, reduced violence against women, expanded educational opportunities for children, and the amelioration of unnecessary human suffering among the people of the world. And why is that, ladies and gentlemen? It's because desperate people should be seen as a national security risk. Desperate people do desperate things. Desperate people are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. That is why I want a United States Department of Peace, because we need to have a far more robust relationship and partnership between those who must prepare for war, if war must come, and those who are actually cultivating peace. You see, when I was a child, ladies and gentlemen, politicians used to talk about peace and prosperity. And I asked myself a few years ago, why don't they talk about peace and prosperity anymore? My first thought was, I guess because it's a cliche. And then I realized, no, that's not why they don't talk about it. They don't talk about it because it's not the goal anymore. It's not the goal anymore. You either make corporate profits your goal or you make peace and prosperity your goal. I'll tell you how we could have prosperity in this country. You want to know how we could have prosperity in 20 years? Take better care of your 10-year-olds today. You want to know the power that would make for amazing, amazing abundance in this country over the next century? It's not in the wind, not in the sun, not in the ground. It's in the brain, particularly the brains of children. We know things now about the brains of children. That's why we need a massive realignment of investment in the direction of America's children. It's why if you make me president, what's going to happen is that all policy, both domestic and international, will be based around a core value. What is it that would help people thrive? What is it that would unleash the dreams of people? What it is that would uncap the spirit of people so that people are more likely to thrive? If you don't have to worry about what's going to happen if you get sick. That's why you should have universal health care, because too many people live in chronic tension and anxiety in America, not knowing what will happen if they have a $400 or a $500 expenditure that they didn't expect. 40% of all Americans live in chronic economic anxiety. Millions of Americans don't know what would happen if they got sick. Millions of Americans don't know what would happen if a child got sick. Millions of Americans don't know what would happen, how they're going to send their kids to college, which should be free at state colleges and universities. And too many Americans don't know how they're going to pay their college loans off. You know what, ladies and gentlemen? One of the biggest lies at the center of all this is the idea that somehow we don't have a lot of money. Oh, we have a lot of money. We need to stop giving it away to the 10% of 1%. And then we need to cancel those college loans. We need to make college loans free at the state colleges and universities. We need to have universal health care. We have to have capital available. We need to stop with this aristocratic notion that a bunch of corporate aristocrats are going to sit up there at their high perch and just drop crumbs from the table in the form of job creation. Let me tell you something. You have one political party that sees nothing wrong with dropping the crumbs, but you have too many people, even in our political party, who say, you don't have to take crumbs, you could have a cookie. That's not what I say. I say we all get to feast here. What the American people should be saying to the corporate aristocrats is, give me free health care, give me a good free education, and give me a shot. I'll create my own damn career. And so, ladies and gentlemen, If you ask me, we've lost our rambunctiousness. We've lost the sense of healthy rebellion that is at the core of all growth. It's at the core of life. It's in America's DNA. We were born out of that. We were born out of that. We were born out of these extraordinary principles, and yet the same people, we all know this, the same people who signed the Declaration of Independence, 41 out of the 54, the 56, whatever it was, they themselves were slave owners. So we've always had these two sides of us. We've always had these amazing aspirational enlightened principles, and we've also had, throughout our history, the forces which have often been the most violent kinds of transgression against the principles on which we stand. But every generation makes its choice. Every generation writes its own chapter in this ongoing story. And I think it's time for our generation to rise up and do more than just pass some good policies. Yes. It's time for this generation to rise up and say, as other generations have said, particularly to the U.S. government, when it needed to be said, what the hell is going on here? Yes. What the hell is going on here? It is time for the people to rise up. And you know what? If that sounds radical to you, democracy is radical. If that sounds radical to you, love is radical. To say we will make, I'll tell you what I want for every child in America. I want more than universal preschool. I want more than free college. I want every school in America to be a palace of learning and culture and the arts. I want to end this ridiculous way, which is the only country that does that, where the majority of our educational funding comes through property taxes, so that a rich kid has a good public school education and a child in a poor neighborhood hardly gets a shot. It's not that I'm anti-capitalist. That's not anti-capitalist to say that these things should be available. Think of all these young people with these burdened by these college loans who would love nothing more. All they want to do is get a shot at it, get them in, let them get in there, but they can't get in because they're burdened by those college loans. No, ladies and gentlemen, either we are a country where the government is of the people, by the people, for the people, or we are of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations. We need to spell it out that clearly. And when we do, we're motivated. When we do, we can actually go to the American people in 2020 and say to all those millions of people who didn't vote, it will be different this time. Because so many people didn't vote because they feel like it's almost like as dysfunctional as it is a passive form of rebellion. It's people saying, I will not participate in something I know is just exploiting me. And in too many cases, they were right. So we can win if we say, but it will be different this time. It will be different this time. Because we will have a massive realignment of investment in the direction of our children, and we will hold capitalism to account, and we will make these deep transformative changes, and we will wage peace, and we will pay reparations, and we will deal with the same kind of reparative measures that must be taken with injustice towards Native Americans. We will deal with the fact that 43 million Americans live in poverty, and 43 million Americans are, more than that, live in poverty, but 43 million Americans are hungry and 13 million children are hungry. We will not look away. We will not look away. Too much the government looks away. It looks away from things which we must not look away from. And I will leave you with this. I read an interview where Jerry Kushner said that he was with his father-in-law, I get stuck on this every time, at a McDonald's. They were at a McDonald's, he said, and he told his father-in-law that there were a lot of angry people out there, he said, and we could harness all that anger, he said, and make you president. I read that, and I felt so clearly in my heart, I felt you're on, because I felt there are so many wonderful people that I see out there, so many dignified people, so many good people who do care about mercy and do care about justice, and do care about liberty, and do care about goodness, and do care about conscience, and we could harness all that and change the world. Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not just fix America. Let's do everything we possibly can to help the world. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne.
Thank you, Seth. Is that on? I don't think
I don't know.
Seth's microphone is on.
Is it on? Oh, yes.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground.
I know, I already talked probably a lot of things. Did I?
I think a round of applause for the signers. That was amazing that they kept up with you.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, but there's a few things we haven't covered, and
Okay.
I thought I would ask a few more questions. The first is something that it strikes close to home, I think, for anyone who lives in Los Angeles, is across the country, and that's the growing homelessness epidemic. I'm wondering, how in the past few years, as it's blown up, there's tent cities everywhere, how it makes you feel and how you would address this out-of-control problem.
There's a term that's used today, and appropriately so, and that's intersectionality. Everything relates to everything. We need to realize how many people who are homeless today were not homeless and had jobs. This is something that is about people who have fallen out of the system. And that is exactly what I was talking about earlier tonight. If you have a system, if you have a governmental system that basically works on behalf of an economic system that rests on, and this is what this virulent form of capitalism does. A virulent strain of capitalism requires cheap labor. So it requires squeezing as much as possible out of people so that it's not a system that is built up with a bottom line of how do we help people. It's all about what your intentions are in terms of governmental policy as much as it is about in our personal lives. What is our intention? When the cities of the United States actually have the intention, now they did something in Utah once where they worked with actually just providing homes. They worked with providing homes for everyone who is homeless. It did not, in the long run, have the kind of success rate on a long-term basis that they expected, because they realized that it has to be more than just providing homes. It has to do with more than just that. It has to do with drug rehabs. It has to do with all the various ways. It has to do with food. It has to do with giving people life and purpose. That has to do with them being part and contributing to their own season of repair. There's not like a one policy that's going to fix homelessness. Some of the best minds in the United States have worked on homelessness policy. It's not like there's one policy that's going to fix it, but what there is a national consensus that no one in the United States, can you imagine, think of all the power in the United States, think of all the money in the United States, and think of all of the consciousness of the American people. If it is our goal, just like President Kennedy said we will go to the moon. Think of what this means. Not one person who wants a home shall be without it. Your entire economic system would be ordered differently. Your entire tax system would be ordered differently. Your entire educational system would be ordered differently. Homelessness is a symptom, it is not a cause. And that is why when I talk about a season of repair is different than a policy here or a policy of there. It has to do with a holistic view of all of the ways in which millions and millions of people drop out because they do not serve the system. And if people are just dropped out because they don't serve the system, their pain is so great, their despair is so great, people give up. A lot of the homeless that you're talking about, when people say that our economy is doing well and our employment rate is, the unemployment is low, a lot of those numbers are so skewed and such a lie because of all the people just falling out of the system. They're not even being counted.
A heated moment at the debate tonight covered gun violence. I wonder, there was a lot of agreement that it's bad, but I didn't hear a lot of hard plans for how to really address it.
Well, certainly when it comes to the policies, I'm right there with the other progressive Democrats. We all would agree with that. Most of Americans would agree, for instance, that we want universal background checks. We need to close the loopholes. We need to close the boyfriend loopholes. We need to close the gun show loopholes. We need to outlaw bump stocks. We need to outlaw military-style weapons. And I also agree with the people on the stage today who are saying that we need the mandatory buyback of the assault weapons. But ladies and gentlemen, I'll tell you something. And I wrote an op-ed that was in Washington Post just, I think, last week or so about this that you can read. This ties into my wanting a United States Department of Peace. And this also is an example of where we treat symptoms, but we need to go deeper and we need to treat cause. We need all the things that I just said, but we also need to ask ourselves deep in our hearts, why are we such a violent culture? Why are we such a violent society? And all of us have to look inside ourselves. All of us have to look in the violence in our own hearts. All of us have to look at our own mean-spiritedness sometimes. There's some guns in our heads sometimes. We have to look at the ways that we have allowed social media to bring out the worst in us. And with all due respect and love, because I've lived most of my adult life in Los Angeles, and I've gave birth to my daughter here, I hope that Hollywood will take a good look at itself. Some of the gratuitous sex, the gratuitous violence against women, when you see them in movies and television, do you know how many images of violence, particularly violence against women, the average 8-year-old has seen? Yeah. Thousands and thousands. So if we are going to deal with, we need to do with more than just deal with gun violence. We need to do everything we can possibly do within the purview of respect for the Second Amendment. Absolutely, I'm for all of those things. But ladies and gentlemen, we must declare peace. It's not enough to just say we don't want gun violence. We have to decide, do we want a nonviolent society? Because if we want a nonviolent, it's like with war. You can't, it's the same problem. You can't just back yourself up into peace, and you can't just think that if you just treat the ways people express their violence, although I'm all for that. I'm all for the most stringent, this is an emergency, everything we can possibly do in terms of gun safety laws. And each and every one of us, this is another example where you and I have to look at ourselves. How mean we can all be, how much we abandon one another, how much we walk over each other's pain too much. So this season of repair, we need an integrative politics. Just like you have an integrative healing of the body, we need an integrative healing of our society. And that means on all levels. And it also means that each and every one of us has to see ourselves as an immune cell. When you talk about the violence in this society, it's so horrible, and all of us have to ask ourselves, where am I even emotionally violent? Where did I say something that maybe I shouldn't have said? Or Mike has a lot of, you said it how you shouldn't have said it, or the tone with which you said it. That can hurt people. I mean, all of us. I don't think any of us are without the places in our own lives where we would, if we were to ask, are you genuinely nonviolent? It has to be at that level. So yes, those are the all of those things that I mentioned about gun safety regulation, and that's why I want a United States Department of Peace. If you have children who grow up in the kind of chronic trauma, if you look at the people in the United States prison system who have committed violent crimes, in almost every not almost every case, but in the majority of cases, these are people who experience violence as children. Either violence perpetrated against them or violence perpetrated against their parents. So on all of these issues, it could be the opioid crisis, it could be homelessness, it could be mass incarceration, it could be gun violence. If we do not take a massive realignment, make a massive realignment, not only in an investment, but focus and intention on children 10 years or younger, none of this will be fundamentally repaired.
Wow. Speaking about the opioid crisis, I wonder what, if any, plans you have to combat it, and what lessons we can take from it regarding
well, the lessons we can take from it are many, and of course they have to do with the pharmaceutical companies that even now pharmaceutical executives are being indicted. We know about the Sackler family and so forth. So what happened here, ladies and gentlemen? It's not just that the predatory practices on the part of big pharma related to OxyContin and other painkillers. The issue is, it's exactly what I've been talking about all night. The problem is not just that there were greedy big pharmaceutical executives who knowingly overmarketed, knowingly led to overprescription, and knowingly overmanufactured. It's the fact that the regulatory agencies such as Food and Drug Administration, CDC, Centers for Disease Control, et cetera, were asleep at the wheel. And why were they asleep at the wheel? And that's because Big Pharma practically owns them.
This is what's wrong, ladies and gentlemen. The problem is not just that these things happen, but that the regulatory processes that you and I are raised to believe would be protecting us from such things were so switched off. And I'm afraid if we do not talk about it at the level that we need to talk about it, no matter who wins the presidency next time, it's not going to change on the level it needs to change. Whether it has to do with the coziness of FAA to Boeing, or it has to do with the coziness of FDA and CDC to Big Pharma, we need to realize that regulatory agencies are there for a reason. Now, in the meantime, obviously, we need to decriminalize. Obviously, we need to see this as a public health issue and not a criminal issue. Obviously, we need more money for rehab systems, et cetera. And this is also another example of where we have the kind of experts who know what to do. But I always go back to the children, because you and I have to ask ourselves, what kind of a country do we have that so many tens of thousands of people find it simply too painful to be alive here? What is going on? And all that starts in childhood. So I've said to people in some of the states that have the opioid crisis in the most critical ways, I've said, you can treat the symptom and treat the addict, but if you don't look over here at all the people so underserved that they end up at risk of whatever desperate behavior. This is what I said to you about international. It's true internationally and it is true domestically. Desperate people do desperate things. So why don't you treat the despair? What'd you say? Legalize marijuana.
Legalize omni-available voluntary euthanasia.
Oh, I haven't gone to that.
What place does spirituality have in government, if any?
Well, let's talk about the difference between spirituality and religion. The separation of church and state is one of the most enlightened aspects of the United States Constitution. But we should be very clear about what it is and about what it isn't. The separation of church and state has a dual function. On one hand, it means, let's say this was the Congress of the United States sitting here. No mufti, minister, rabbi, priest, monk, is going to come down the aisle in the U.S. Congress and say you can't pass this law or you have to pass that law, such as would happen in a country like Iran. That's not going to happen here. Our government is protected from interference by religious clergy, doctrine, or dogma. That's half of it. The other half of it is equally important, and one which I've been very grateful for and very cognizant of in my own career. You could have a church, a synagogue, a mosque, an AA meeting, an atheist meeting, a Course in Miracles meeting, a meditation class, I don't care what it is. You're not going to have a policeman come in and say, break it up. No policeman can say, you're not on the list. That's a huge deal. And notice that I said young atheists, because it is as protective, the separation of church and state is as protective of non-believers as it is protective of the right of people to believe however they wish. It's also if they wish. As Thomas Jefferson said, whether a man picks my pocket or breaks my leg, whether a man believes in one God or 20 gods, no gods or 20 gods, neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. So that separation of church and state is extremely important. But notice, the founders were not seeking to suppress the religious conversation. They were seeking to protect it. They were seeking to liberate it. Now, spirituality is the path of the heart. There's no doctrine. There's no dogma. It's moral questioning. It's ethical questioning. It's asking what is right and what is wrong. Now, what we have in our society is a lack of that. That's what's wrong with our society today. And it's not that we as individuals don't ask those questions. We as individuals certainly do. The American people are good people. The American people ask, what's the right thing to do? Am I in integrity? Am I acting with character? Am I doing right by you? Shouldn't I forgive you? Should I judge you so harshly? I don't find that the average American person isn't doing this. The issue is we have kept that conversation to our own private lives too much. I'll talk about it with my own friends or my own system and my own company. We have to ask these questions about our society. So when you say, what role does spirituality play? It means we would ask ourselves, how can we have mass incarceration? How can we abide by the fact that you have racial disparity in criminal sentencing to the point where drug use is the same whether you're white or you're black, but if you're black, you're going to get a 4 or 5 times harsher sentence? mass incarceration, racial disparity in sentencing, racial disparity in police engagement, the fact that private prisons even exist, the fact that we have lost so much moral authority in the way we deal internationally. These are moral questions. These are spiritual questions. Spirituality is the path of the heart. And as I said to you before, where there is no love, people act like that's a naive thing to talk about. People say, oh, you're naive to think love can become the organizing principle of our society. This is what I say to you, and I say this to you as a candidate for president. I say that what is naive is to believe we will even exist on this planet for another 100 years if we don't at least try. It is central. Who am I really and what am I doing? What is the purpose of my life? Is the purpose of my life not to be a good person, to be righteous, to be humble, to have some faith in each other, to practice love and compassion? What is a life without that questioning? And what is a country without that questioning? I'll tell you what a country without that questioning is. A soulless, heartless place in a lot of trouble.
Okay. And finally, if you could pinpoint it, when did you decide to run?
I can't pinpoint it because it wasn't like that. It was, and I'm sure for everybody who thinks, nobody runs for president impulsively. This is a very hard thing to do. And one of the things that gives me a lot of compassion for the other candidates is that I wake up every day, go through my day, and know that they're going through the same stuff. And there's a sense of camaraderie because nobody else is going through what this group is going. It's interesting. I didn't think it would be easy, and I didn't think it would be without the mean-spiritedness that I have encountered. I don't think I thought it was going to be this mean, or this based on, what they do. But I continued to ask in my own heart. I talked to people that I respect very much, both people very close to me personally as well as people I know in politics, etc. It is hard, but I'm not sorry I'm doing this at all. And I'll tell you why. The things I'm talking to you about tonight, about a massive realignment in the direction of our children, about the kind of mobilization around the environment that we need to make that is so massive it's no different than mobilization for something like World War II. The idea that we need a Department of Peace as well as a Department of Defense because our defense budget, our national security agenda is so driven by short-term profits for defense contractors. We have, for instance, the U.S. Air Force has ordered 100 B-21 Raiders. The B-21 Raider is an airplane that costs $550 million, and each one carries both conventional as well as nuclear weapons. Now I want to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, why do we need 100 airplanes that drop nuclear weapons? Because you drop 5 of those, every nuke that exists on the planet today makes Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like pinpricks. So you drop 5 of those and human civilization as we know it is over. You drop 10 of those and most probably the human species on this planet is over for at least hundreds of thousands of years. So you tell me, at that 550 million, and also what would that do for the children of America? So let me ask you, do you think that we have those 100 airplanes for our legitimate security? No. Of course we don't. Of course we don't. Now, this is the thing. I'm talking to you about this. I'm talking to you about children, traumatized children. I'm talking to you about a Department of Peace. I'm talking to you about reparations. It wouldn't be the same. I'm a candidate for President of the United States. Takes it to a whole new place. Puts a whole lot more on you. But it's a vortex, Oh, God, that's going to be in the press. Oh, my God. Williamson called her candidacy a vortex. I can see it on Yahoo News. Oh, that wackadoodle Williamson. I've been so good all night. We all know how wacky she is. We all know what a nutcase she is. So you know what I mean. It's a platform unlike any other. It's a platform like, is that good? Platform is very established. It's a platform unlike any other. So the fact that I'm talking about those things, I've been talking about those things. People say stay in your lane. Of course they say it. And what they're saying is stay in the lane where you can't actually do anything to change it. That's what they're saying when they say stay in your lane. They're saying don't disrupt anything here. So the way I look at it is people say write books. I have written books. I write plenty of books. My last one is called A Politics of Love. It's about all this. But when you're running for president, you're saying to the people of the United States, you can have this if you want it.
All right, well, thank you. And we should remind everyone that you're still eligible for the next debate in October.
Of course. And I hope all of you will go to Marianne 2020. And I hope all of you, particularly those with Livestream, and as well, of course, as those of you here. I might make it into the fourth debate, but it's bigger than that. It's bigger than that. It's bigger than a debate. We saw these debates tonight. Is that all this is about? Really? Ladies and gentlemen, this is about the fate of our country. This is about whether or not we decide to move in another direction. And if you do want to do that, I hope that you will do everything possible to support my candidacy. I'm not doing this just to elevate the conversation. Anybody who thinks all this business of, oh, she's not qualified, I want to say something with all due respect. Anybody who thinks that somebody who's been in Congress, they're like so qualified, what do you think? Half their time is spent raising money. Now, I think that these people, other people who are running, are very, very lovely people, very good people, and they certainly have qualifications, but so do I. And I believe that the qualifications that I have for the last 35 years, working up close and personal with people who are in crisis, is what has given me the insight to navigate a country in crisis. Why? Because a country is not just, it is a group of people. You have to navigate a shift among the people. When people say, oh, she just knows how to motivate, knows how to inspire, I'm like, yeah, you might want to think about that. This is the deal. Franklin Roosevelt said that the primary responsibility of the presidency is moral leadership. He said the primary responsibility is not the administrative aspect. So I have a lot of respect for political expertise and political experience, but we have a lot of political expertise. What we don't have enough of is what we most need in the next president, and that is political vision. So, ladies and gentlemen, you can talk about political experience, but some very experienced politicians took us into the war in Vietnam. Very experienced politicians took us into the war in Iraq. Very experienced politicians led us to where we are. The problem with this president is not his lack of experience. The problem with this president is lack of ethics. His lack of apparently visceral taste for democracy, his lack of respect for the pillars of democratic traditions. I have a lot of respect for those things. And you can have the best car mechanic in the world, but the best car mechanic doesn't necessarily know what road you should take to Milwaukee. So I believe that what we're dealing with is an extraordinarily and critically different moment in America. We do not need to be led by a political system that is entrenched in the 20th century. We need 21st century thinking. It is far more holistic, it is far more integrative, and it is one that recognizes that we must have vision, we must have imagination, we must go for what we want. You know, we can't just deal with circumstances. We have to have a vision of the world that we want, and it must be much bigger than just fixing this and fixing that. We must imagine. You know, I heard Dennis Kucinich say, I remember this years ago, he said, we must challenge the belief that war is inevitable. We must challenge the belief. We're not going to, we must imagine, we must envision a world in which there's not so much unnecessary human suffering. All these people who meet, our president and all these presidents meet at the G7 meeting. You make me president, I'm going to say, we need to put in a meeting about global poverty. We need to put in a meeting about the fact that 12,000 children starve every day. There are so many things like that about which the system would look at me and say, you can't say that. And you know what I say? Watch me. Make me president. I'll make you proud. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Seth Abramovich. Thank you. I'm sorry. I listened to so many things before we even got there.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.